Sure, sure. Wonderful to be with everybody today. How are we doing? Thumbs up? Good? Amazing. Wonderful to be together. Very, very challenging and interesting week of Daf Yomi that we had together. Um, I want to actually we're going to be exploring Daf 11-ish to Daf 18-ish. And one thing I just want to start with as an overview, because I think it's probably weighing on a lot of people, myself included, is how do we deal theologically with the idea of human beings as anything other than human beings, right? Like property, ownership, enslavement, there are all sorts of things that are very tricky to deal with and think about. I want to just provide a few approaches as we begin. We talked about a number of different categories this week. We talked about marriage, right? The acquisition of a partner via money. We talked about the institution of slavery, both non-Jews and Jews. And we also talked about what's called the Ama Ivria, the girl that's sold into slavery under the age of 12. Now, of course, with our 21st century glasses on, this is horrifying. But let's just join with me and come into the world of the Talmud for just a moment. I want to talk about each of these categories. I think a good way to think about the difference between each of these categories is that, first of all, a marriage is a change in status, right? It's a change in status mostly. And no one owns anyone, which is like pretty clear in the laws of Kedushin. Eved Ivri, this slave that's the Hebrew servant that's paying back a debt, is an ownership of that person's work. And an Eved Kanani is outright ownership as property. So these are like the three categories here. A historical note for a minute. It seems like the whole concept of Eved Ivri, so becoming enslaved to pay back a debt, has died out before the Mishnah was codified, because this was only practiced at times where Yovel was practiced, the Jubilee year was practiced. But let's just talk about what each of these things are, technically, sociologically. So in terms of an Eved Ivri, right, someone who owes a debt and has to pay it back, or they steal, it allows, it's kind of like, prison, that whole thing we have today, prison, right? So this was not an idea as much as the idea of, I have a thief here, and your job now is to go work and to have a reset, right? He's going to take care of his debt, probably actually learn a trade, and then go back into the world. And at the end of the whole process, gets what's called ha'anaka, which is severance, right? So can you imagine actually being prosecuted for a white collar crime or any sort of theft, right? And then, okay, the punishment is you have to go work somewhere, learn a trade, and then you get some money at the end of the whole thing, right? So it's degrading, right? But at the end of the day, it's not, it's of the solutions, it's not terrible, which is interesting. Okay, so that's the Hebrew servant approach. In terms of the Jewish female servant who's sold by her father below the age of 12, that was often a way out of poverty to marry into a different social status. And in terms of Eved Kanani, the Canaanite slaves, I don't have a great answer for that. So that was like, I would say the theological approach to that is that human beings have kind of subjugated other human beings forever. And what this set of laws does is it actually transforms the Eved Kanani to a type of property which you're supposed to care about, right? You actually have to, take care of it in a certain way, and it's not a nice feeling to imagine it as to imagine a person as property. But what's happening is it's limiting what we're allowed to do in the confines of enslavement. So all of these things, of course, are difficult, but a good approach to just think about. Feel free, by the way, to, while we are going through, put questions or comments in the chat. I am now going to just hop through the different dapim, see some highlights from every page. There was a fascinating discussion on Daf 11 about what the minimum payment should be for Kedushin. Beit Shammai had a really interesting approach. They were like, a woman would never get married for anything less than a dinar, right? That would never happen. And Beit Hillel says, probably a pruta is fine, a lesser denomination of money. So it's interesting. This is very Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai, they're kind of reaching for the stringent ideal, and then Beit Hillel is kind of working with what's going on the ground. So that was the discussion on Daf 11. We had a huge debate about different kinds of coins. What's a pruta? What's an isar? What's a ma'a? And how do each of these things actually translate into currency? All right. And actually, Beit Shammai say their opinion that a woman should not be kedushified, right? She should not receive kedushin for anything less than a dinar. Why? Shelo yehu benot Yisrael kehefker, so that the daughters of Israel aren't presented as ownerless, meaning like want people to make it so easy to just go ahead and get married and get divorced, whatever it is. It should actually cost something in general. Remember, we learned in the Mishnah that a marriage or a kedushin, this first level of Jewish marriage, can be affected in 3 ways. Who can put it first in the chat? 3 ways. 3 ways in the chat. 3 ways. Let's go. All right, I'm going to give it 5. There you go. There's one in Hebrew. Let's see if someone can get it in English. So bia is sexual intercourse. Shtar would be a document, and kesef would be money. Now, we started to explore on the daf this week that actually, sanctifying or betrothing someone through sex was not desired. It was definitely limited by the rabbis, which is interesting because it seems to be that what we're learning in these dafs is that some kind of reflection period, some definitely consent, right? All of these things are relevant when it comes to Kedushin. And the sages didn't want sex to be something that could be both impulsive and marital. Right? It didn't make sense to them. And so what we're doing is we start to limit the 3 methods to 2, to shtar, document, and kesef, money. Now today, the major method we use is kesef, money, and that's usually through a ring. Remember the whole discussion this week about the silk and how much is this silk worth? I don't know if a woman gets betrothed with silk and we don't know how much it's worth. Well, what do we do? So this is one of the reasons why in Jewish marriage today, many are careful to only give a simple ring with no stones, no etchings, things like that. And simple engraving is fine. But why no stones? For this very reason, for this week's daf, the idea that sometimes its appraisal value is unclear, and we are choshesh, we are concerned for the opinion that says if its appraisal value is unclear, we can't use it as a method for Kedushin. So that was also from this week's daf. So much contemporary stuff in this week's daf in terms of Jewish marriage as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about consent for a second. We saw it's very interesting because contemporary discussions about consent and sex were relevant to this week's stuff. We saw a debate about whether a woman's silence is consent for erusin, for when it comes to betrothal. What if someone throws her like a thing, right, and is like, Kedushin me, right? Betroth yourself to me. And she doesn't say anything. Is that consent or not? And there's a debate about what consent means. Is it when she says yes, or was it when she's silent, right? And so there was that back and forth, which is quite relevant and quite interesting. And you can think about for yourself, which one makes more sense? Actually her saying, yes, I consent to marry you, or silence. So I don't know if you recall, but a few days ago, we also said it depends on the context, right? It absolutely depends. Were they talking about marriage beforehand? Had they agreed to marriage beforehand? And then they toss a ring back and forth across the room or something like that. Remember, there was this story where he steals something that belongs to her, and tries to betroth her with it. It's wild, right? He's like, yoink, harayat mikudeshetli, right? So a similar idea of, what does that really mean? Does she want that to be the method of Kedushin? Isn't it really hers in the first place? Really quite interesting discussions. This, I believe, was last Shabbat. We discussed these things. Okay. Then we got into this whole question of different kinds of servitude, right? We first, and I'm curious to actually just get a sense in the room, should there be a difference between someone who voluntarily sells themselves into slavery to avoid poverty or pay back a debt, or one who is sold by the court to pay off theft? Should there be a difference, halachically, between those two kinds? So again, someone who sells themselves to, get out of poverty or to pay back a debt, or someone the court sells because of theft. And you could just throw it in the chat. What do you think? Should there be a difference? Yes or no? What do you think? I see a head shake from Odedia, maybe not, shouldn't be a difference. And Odedia, do you want to say why maybe not? And then Charles says yes, but do you want to share anything or nah? You don't have to. No worries. See if I can ask you. No, it's okay. All right. So, thank you for your head shake. That was awesome. And Charles just says, yes, there should be a difference. Where's Charles at? Is Charles able to talk? I don't know. No, but that's okay, because you can see there's a difference of opinion in the room. Beautiful, just like the Gemara. So this idea that there should or should not be a difference between these two categories is the subject of the debate of the last 3 days, right? Should there be a difference in these kinds of Jewish servants or not? Now, someone who would say no, maybe Odedia might say this, no, there shouldn't be a difference. At the end of the day, it's theologically the same thing. Right? It's a person who decides to, oh, sorry, Charles. It decides, you can try to type it out. It decides to actually, a person decides to become enslaved, right? To someone other than God for the purposes of, whatever their life circumstances were. Fine. And maybe it doesn't matter in either way, but that is the discussion there. Give me 1 second. Sorry. So there is that is one category, and the other category is actually the idea that someone stole and they should be penalized, right? So you can see that there really could be a difference. Okay, so Charles, if you want to unmute, we can do that for you if you want. I don't see you though.
Just make sure you're raising your hand so I can find you.
Charles Shapiro raises Charles's hand. Oh, no, go for it. One more time.
Yeah, I haven't thought about this deeply, but as you said, someone who's been a thief is being enslaved against their will versus the one who's voluntarily enslaved. So I think there's a difference. I don't know if the rules should be different for them, but there's certainly a difference in the internal status of the slave.
Yeah. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Thank you so much. So again, this question of distinctions or lack of distinctions between the rules for various kinds of these Ivri slaves. And remember, there's actually a third category, which is nirtza, right? Someone who chooses to stay beyond the 6 years that they have to pay. They become slaves for the duration. We also talked about the death of the master and if that frees somebody. And just a little note, we also got into a discussion about how do we know that the death of a husband actually frees a woman to remarry? Do you remember this? I didn't even expect the Gemara to go here in some ways. I was like, of course, death of the husband, of course, would cause a woman to be able to remarry. But there was a real question, does that, how do we know? Is she not part of this bond forever? So we looked at that for a little while. On a couple days ago on that daf. Okay. On daf 16, we saw something really interesting about Gezerah Shavas. Who knows what a Gezerah Shava is? Gezerah Shava is when you actually take two different words in two different halachic contexts in the Torah and you apply them to each other in each of their respective contexts. And just a little bit of a hint. Yeah, right, Rob. I should. So our Daf Yomi class, which you're all invited to, we sometimes get a little silly, and there are so many gezerah shavas, so many times where the rabbis use this method that I said, wouldn't it be funny if there was a jingle every time a gezerah shava came up? It'd be like, it's gezerah shava time. So actually my father, who's a musician, wrote a jingle, and I'll play it for you right at the end. So that will be fun. But a gezerah shava, actually, you can't make up a gezerah shava. So let's say, I don't know, I'm just looking around the room. Let's say Virginia decides to take one verse in Genesis and then another verse in Exodus, and take the same word and connect them with each other and now say, oh my gosh, everything's the same. I created halacha, right? Actually, she wouldn't be able to do that because a gezerah shava is something that is a received tradition. It has to be received for many, many generations. But this week on the daf, we actually challenged a few gezerah shavas. There were people who didn't hold. They didn't agree with some accepted traditions around gezerah shavas. So that was very interesting. We went back and forth around that for actually a couple of days. One more final piece, and then we'll close. We talked about a bill of sale for these kinds of servitude. And I just want to name that there were bills of sale that were used in two ways. One way was a receipt given by the seller to a buyer as a proof of purchase, or a contract given to effect marriage, given by the purchaser to the purchasee, right? So we discussed, what is the sale of the servant? What is that more like? It's actually more like a marriage document than a buyer document, which is fascinating. So there's a lack of the clarity about an Eved Ivri. What is this category of person? So we, again, just a reminder from the beginning, we talked about that what really is being owned here is the person's work, which is similar to the business arrangement of marriage, right? Which is that the husband owns her profits, right? And her domestic labor in some ways. And as a closing remark here, it's just a reminder that Kiddushin kind of fluctuates between two approaches of marriage. The very, very business-oriented, logistical wage and rights approach or obligations approach. This is what she gets, this is what she gives, etc. We learn this source from the sale of Ephron's field to Abraham, right? It's all about transaction. And then, of course, there's the other model, which is Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve and partnership, and you are the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh. That's a different thing. That's not part of the financial arrangement, though we can, of course, start to play with the ideas of why that would be true. Yeah, can I call on Claudette? I think I can.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for showing out all the points of this past week. And I just wanted to go a little bit off topic to have us celebrate Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who 100 years ago this past week on the 9th of Elul is when we celebrate 100 years of the Daf. He suggested it 100 years ago, and I feel honored to be part of it this year.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so Claudette reminds us that we have the 100th anniversary of the
institute. On the 9th of Elul, it was his 100th anniversary.
Of the Daf Yomi, which is really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Claudette. So for the final thing that we'll do today, and I can't wait to see you again next time, is I'll play you the gezerah shava jingle. Sound good? Thumbs up? And everyone can think about it every time a gezerah shava comes up in the Talmud. And if you're still not sure what a gezerah shava is, I am sure that in all of the My Jewish Learning documents and articles, there's been an exploration of it. It's something that maybe we can all commit to understand a little better after today. Here we go.
It's gezerah shava time.
There you go. All right, everybody. Happy Gemara learning. Have a wonderful day. See you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.